Now the Three Martini Lunch with Greg Corombos and Jim Garrity.
And welcome, everyone, to the Thursday edition of the Three Martini Lunch, along with Jim Garrity of National Review. He's also the author of The Weed Agency. I'm Greg Corombos of Radio America. We've got good, bad, and crazy martinis for you as usual. And, Jim, we start with the good, and we talked about it a little bit in context of the bad martini earlier in the week, and that was Hillary Clinton talking about her financial destitution when she and Bill Clinton left the White House and her really poor answers when it came to Benghazi. Just yesterday, I guess it was, Charlie Rose had on the authors of Game Change, and I forget the title of a book they wrote after the 2012 race, but it was John Heilman and Mark Halperin, and he asked them, what did they think of Hillary Clinton's rollout? What did they think of the book? What did they think of her performance in these interviews? And John Heilman not mincing many words here.
Very, very rusty. Mark used a phrase earlier this week. He said he thought the book was tone deaf. I thought, and the book was mush, and the interview was tone deaf. And I think that's probably true. I'm not through the whole book yet, but I think those are both accurate. And frankly, although I think Diane did a very nice job, you could imagine her asking some very, very tough follow-up questions.
And then Mark Halperin went on to say, she wrote this book, and there's really not any sort of message about what a Hillary presidency would be about, so it's a total wasted opportunity, which, if you're not interested in a Hillary presidency, is a pretty good thing, Jim.
There is some good news for Hillary. And the good news for Hillary this week is that the Bergdahl trade is blowing up and looks terrible, and Iraq is burning down. And that's the good news. Oh, and Cantor's defeat. In the sense that, look, it's very hard to say, this rollout went exactly the way she expected, and boy, she's just nailing every one of these. It's been she does look rusty. This is a bad start. The good news for her is that you can say this won't do that much damage because people aren't going to remember it because it's being consumed by the news cycle. She'll get maybe another start when she officially announces her campaign and stuff. Now, what's kind of intriguing about this is it kind of suggests that maybe there's a little bit of lackadaisical lethargy in the approach of Hillary, that she wasn't expecting the why were you making so much money in all those speeches question. And in the process of doing it, she talks about how hard it is with her multiple houses. One of the really intriguing things in that Heilman interview is he says, look, Sawyer asked some very tough initial questions, but generally kind of laid off on the follow-ups. Why do you and Bill need multiple houses? Why do you need such big houses? Isn't he getting a large pension from the taxpayers from being president? There were a lot of questions that could have been asked there and really could have made her sweat. Obviously, they decided enough damage had been done. Her book gets something wrong on Benghazi. The way it's written, it appears that there were Marines in Tripoli at the time, and there were not. Apparently, even Rahm Emanuel kind of had to say, dead broke? Come on, which is not the kind of questioning I think she expected to get here. So the good news for her is that she'll get another shot at this. The bad news is, and I think this is generally right, she's going to be running on it's time for a woman and kind of this generic vote for me because of my gender message. But, the question of how would a Hillary presidency look different from this one is going to be a really pressing question. Wherein the other great question is, as I mentioned Iraq, as I mentioned Syria continuing to be a mess, the world is in worsening chaos right now. Kind of hard to make a strong case for the preceding Secretary of State in circumstances like this. So all in all, circumstances are coming together to make a Hillary 2016 run a lot tougher than I think she expected just a few months ago.
All right, on to the bad martini now. And yesterday's bad martini was the fact that radicals, kind of offshoots of al-Qaeda, so radical, in fact, al-Qaeda disavows them, which definitely doesn't put you in good stead with the rest of the world, hopefully. They've taken over Mosul, the second largest city in Iraq. There's widespread reports of Iraqi military folks just taking off their uniforms and surrendering. There's humanitarian crises, folks exiting by the hundreds of thousands out of Mosul. And given the fact that the Iraqi military is abandoning its post, the Kurds have now essentially taken over Kirkuk. And now the radicals are marching towards Samarra and eventually Baghdad. On top of all that, the New York Times reporting here that, quote, as the threat from Sunni militants in western Iraq escalated last month, Prime Minister Nouri al-Maliki secretly asked the Obama administration to consider carrying out airstrikes against extremist staging areas, but Iraq's appeals for a military response have so far been rebuffed by the White House, which has been reluctant to open a new chapter in a conflict that President Obama has insisted was over when the United States withdrew the last of its forces from Iraq in 2011. So, Jim, I think airstrikes is probably the very limit of what the American people would tolerate in terms of renewed military action in Iraq. But given the crisis there, it doesn't look like they're getting any help from us.
I suppose you could say this is what Americans voted for. We are tired of Iraq. We don't want to deal with Iraq. We feel like it was an enormous amount of blood and treasure spent for nothing terribly useful. But let's face it, U.S. interests were better off with Maliki running a relatively stable, relatively anti-terror government out there. And instead, it appears that government is rapidly falling apart. We have too many, apparently enormous numbers of troops abandoning their posts among the Iraqis. The ISIS guys are just unbelievably bloody, ruthless guys who are just a horde advancing on the capital. There's no guarantee of who's going to fight and stand up for this central government. It's possible a year from now, Iraq won't look all that different from Syria, a kind of a capital held by a increasingly brutal force trying to, keep people in charge, and maniac Islamists advancing all around it and causing chaos in the countryside. What's intriguing is going to be once again, the Obama administration, by attitude is like, we're out of this, we're done with this, it's not our problem anymore. By not giving those, we're going to have a really good question. Could those airstrikes a month ago have made a big difference? I mean, there was warning signs when the Al-Qaeda took over Fallujah, and it was like a 2-day story here in the United States, and everybody kind of shrugged and said, it's the Iraqis' problem. Well, we're going to see just how much territory Islamic State of Iraq and Syria can take before they end up launching attacks and targeting Americans. And oh, by the way, the rumor going around last night was that the U.S. Embassy will be evacuated very soon. No word on that this morning, but you just have this awful feeling it's going to be like a flashback to Vietnam, that last helicopter leaving our embassy in Saigon, and just going to be what was a winnable war and what was a relatively stable state just a few years ago will collapse into anarchy, and at some point, perhaps we'll just look at it as a solid defeat for U.S. interests in the Middle East with deep repercussions for the rest of the region and perhaps the world.
If we had kept a residual force, ultimately at some point they would have been pulled out, and you have to wonder if this would have happened anyway, but certainly the way it did play out at the end of 2011 when everyone came home, a lot of folks pointing back to that. And the other interesting thing here, Jim, from the perspective of the Obama administration as well as some Republicans, especially folks like John McCain, there's a magic line between, of course, Iraq and Syria that is a border. On one side of the line, they are evil troglodytes, and on the other side, they're the good guys.
That's a perfectly legitimate point there. On the one hand, while as much as I can understand the instinct to say, throw up your hands and walk away, it's not our problem, the suspicion is at some point I just have a hard time believing this doesn't turn into a petri dish for hatred, for Islamist extremism, for Al-Qaeda-like movements and elements flourishing and at some point killing Americans. And the idea that we don't have any interest out there. Look, we always have interest in protecting Americans, and you just have the sneaking suspicion that large chunks of the Middle East are going to be no-go areas for Americans because neither the U.S. nor its allies nor even the local governments can guarantee their safety out there.
Ugh. All right, on to the crazy.
Bad martini.
That's a very bad martini, especially.
Let's cheer up the apocalypse or something like that.
All right, on to the crazy martini now. And the president, of course, hasn't spent a lot of time, certainly hasn't said anything publicly about this because he's doing more important things. He's talking to the folks who work at Tumblr. And one of the questions he was asked was, where do you see yourself in 10 years? And he talked about sipping drinks out of a coconut on the beach after he leaves the White House, but that more importantly, after that, he and Michelle are really interested and committed to developing young people. He's so impressed with young people, and he wants them to be encouraged about where things stand in the world right now. And here's what he had to say.
Don't get cynical. Guard against cynicism. I mean, the truth of the matter is that for all the challenges we face, all the problems that we have, if you had to choose any moment to be born in human history, not knowing what your position was going to be, who you were going to be, you'd choose this time. The world is less violent than it has ever been. It is healthier than it has ever been. It is more tolerant than it has ever been. It is better fed than it's ever been.
Jim, I guess he hasn't seen the news reports that we talked about in the second martini. What do you make of him saying that this is the golden age of human history?
That last line when he says we're better fed than we've ever been. I do believe at that point Michelle Obama jumped in and said, but we're working on that. We're going to try to fix that. In the broad sense, I suppose I can give the president a bit of credit for some optimism and cheeriness. Let me just observe, though, that one, he says, don't get cynical. Well, Mr. President, you're the one who ran against the Patriot Act and then expanded NSA surveillance. You're the one who said the stimulus is going to do fantastic things for the economy. You're the one who said, if you like your plan, you can keep your plan. You're the one who said how important it was to take care of veterans. Like, people's cynicism is well-founded at this point, okay? It's got details. It's got books to support. It's got footnotes, okay? This is not some general garden variety gloomy Gus, for starters. And the argument that the world is safer than it's ever been, I suppose if you want to compare it to the days of the Cold War and the fact that we don't have, that Russia is not overtly targeting us with nuclear weapons, yeah, I suppose you could say that. But as we said in the second Martini, as we said in Syria, as we said in the saber rattling we're seeing between China and Japan over those uninhabited islands in the South Pacific, you look at North Korea, front after front, there is not a shortage of potential crises and bloody, battles in this world. So there are times he sounds a little Pollyanna-ish in that. And I think at times perhaps this administration just kind of walks around in a bubble, convinced that things are going better than they actually are.
All right. So
that's my crazy Martini.
Kind of a depressing day, but at least we got one good one in there, and the crazy one wasn't as bad as the middle one. But Jim?
A low bar to clear, but yes. So.
Yeah, we'll do better tomorrow, hopefully. See you then.
All right, see you tomorrow, Greg.
Jim Garrity of National Review. I'm Greg Corombos of Radio America. Thanks for being with us today. Please join us on Friday for the next 3 Martini Lunch.